InfraVision Foundation and India Habitat Centre have recently commenced a collaboration on an unusual series focused on infrastructure, which is called InfraKatha, in which a series of experts offer unique insights on subjects ranging from inclusive infrastructure to the difficulty of being good. We've had some scintillating conversations, such as the one with mythologist Devdutt Patnaik, who started off the series, with Paralympian Deepa Malik, with author Gurcharan Das. This evening, in our 4th edition, we will be privileged to listen to economist, author and historian Sanjeev Sanyal, well known to all of us, and the InfraVision Foundation founder, Vinayak Chatterjee, in conversation. Let me go through an introduction for both, although many will say that they do not need any introduction. But I think it's important to get people's diverse backgrounds and the full extent of their background, at least some of the full extent of their backgrounds, on board before we start a conversation of this nature. Sanjeev Sanyal grew up in Kolkata and attended the Sri Ram College of Commerce before going on to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He then spent 2 decades in international financial markets, where he became the managing director and global strategist of Europe's largest bank. He was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2010. While living in Singapore, he also took up the study of cities and was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship for his work on urban dynamics. In 2017, he joined the Indian government as the principal economic advisor. He became a member of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Economic Advisory Council in 2022. He has helped prepare 6 editions of the Economic Survey of India starting in 2017. He has represented India in many international fora, including as co-chair of the Framework Working Group of G20 for 5 years. He's also an author, as we all know. His best-selling books include Land of the Seven Rivers, A Brief History of India's Geography, The Ocean of Churn, How the Indian Ocean Shaped Human History, and Life Over 2 Beers, which is the most intriguing of them all. His latest book is Revolutionaries, The Other Story of How India Won Its Freedom. A big hand, please, for Sanjeev Sanyal. Speaking to Sanjeev will be Vinayak Chatterjee, a very old friend of mine. Very old in terms of years, not in terms of his years. Founder and managing trustee of the InfraVision Foundation, he graduated in economics with honours from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and did his MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He co-founded Feedback Infra Private Limited, a consulting engineering company, in 1990 and served as its chairman from 1990 to 2021. He now devotes his time and energy to infrastructure policy, advocacy, and capacity building. And for this purpose, he founded the InfraVision Foundation, where he is a managing trustee. And we are so glad that they collaborate with us on this series. Thank you very much. A little more about you. He has often been called upon to play a strategic advisory role to leading domestic and international corporates, the Government of India, various ministries dealing with infrastructure, as well as multilateral and bilateral institutions in the area of infrastructure policy, planning and implementation. He's one of the leading proponents of the Public-Private Partnership PPP model for developing India's infrastructure. One of his more recent engagements with the Government of India relates to being a member of the Committee on setting up a DFI, a Development Finance Institution. He heads the Infrastructure Council at the national level of the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, a role he has played several times since 2001. And now here's the WEF Connect. In 1998, the WEF, the World Economic Forum at Davos, recognized him as one of the 100 global leaders of tomorrow. In 2011, the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, conferred on him the Distinguished Alumnus Award. He's on the board of directors of Apollo Hospitals Enterprise Limited, KEC International Limited, and LTI Mindtree Limited. He's also an advisor to some infra companies. He's being reticent here. He's also a well-read columnist, of course. Vinayak, please, may I request you to come up and take the conversation forward. I'm religious about reading all what I've given. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sunil.
Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I suppose let's do a deep dive on the subject. I have a few words of personal introduction to Sanjeev. All of you have heard of the Renaissance man, Italian, European, etc. In Delhi, he is the quintessential Renaissance man. Economist, writer, author, thinker, public policy. So if somebody asked me who is the quintessential Renaissance man in Delhi, I would refer to Sanjeev Sanyal. He's also a very dear friend, and since this is not such a formal gathering, I have to say that between him and his wife, who's sitting on the last row, we've had some excellent evenings together during his, stellar role to play before all of this as the chief economist of Deutsche Bank in Singapore for about 20 years. So he's had a fascinating corporate career and now in public policy. So Sanjeev, just to set you off, I mean, when we announced this topic, people said, close friends of mine said, Vinayak, we've heard of lost baggage at airports. We've heard of lost causes. We've heard of many other, losses. But a lost river, I mean, are you serious? How does one lose a river? So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, let me begin by thanking both India Habitat Centre and InfraVision Foundation for inviting me today. Yes, I will be talking about Saraswati, the lost river, a river which gave rise to our civilization. And as we live through this time of climate change, I think it's important to remember that climate change has happened many times through the long history of the human species, many, many times. And I will be talking about one episode of this, which hopefully you will find interesting. There are those who think it's a mythical river, and I showed you, and I will show you more, that it's clearly not. But then there will be some who will try and place this somewhere in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, and so on. Now that's also quite ridiculous, because the Rig Veda is very, very clear about where this river is. There is something called the Nadi Stuta Suktam. I have given the exact reference, you can go and check it yourself. And in there, there is a chant which goes as follows: O Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shutudru, which is Sutlej, Parushni, which is Ravi, Ashkini, Chenab, and so on. It is clearly listing out the rivers of northwestern India in sequence, going from east to west. Okay? And the sequence, in that sequence, it is very clear that this river Saraswati is between the Yamuna and the Sutlej. Shutudru is the Sutlej. So it's very clear that where its location is. It also tells us, the Rig Veda, again I'm giving you exact references so that you can go and look at it. It says it goes from the mountain to the ocean. So here are what it says: she with her might, like one who parts the lotus stems, had burst her strong waves through the mountain ridges. Pure in a course from the mountain to the ocean, alone the stream of the Saraswati had listened. So again, what do we know? This is a river between the Yamuna and Sutlej, and that it flows from the mountains to the ocean. Now the problem is an obvious one. There is no such river today with that description. But the question is, was there ever such a river, and what is the evidence for it? It turns out, if you do look at for paleo channels in northwestern India, there is a river that used to flow, and there is that can be seen. In fact, you can actually even look this up in Google Maps. It is the dry river channel of a riverbed that occasionally flows in the monsoon. So if you go right now, the upper reaches of it still flow, and we know it today as the Ghaggar. The lower reaches of this are known as the Hakra, but it flows. If you're familiar with Chandigarh, then this is the river channel that is just east of it. Comes out of the Shivalik hills, and at this time of the year, if you go there, it actually flows. It flows all the way through past Haryana, Punjab, and then all into northern Rajasthan, and then basically dries up somewhere a little bit after going into Pakistan. So this riverbed exists. Even in the height of summer, you can see it, because even today, this river, the moisture in the ground as a result of the existence of that river in those days, is still enough that you can see it on the satellite maps because this bit is just a little greener than the surrounding desert in the Thar, even today. So you can actually follow its entire course, and you can see it now would go into what is now Pakistan, comes back into India, and then flows into the area that we now know as the Run of Kutch. The reason the Run of Kutch looks the way it does today is that it was originally the estuary of the Saraswati. At that time, 5,000 years ago, the sea level was higher and this river was flowing, and importantly, the Indus used to also flow somewhat east of where it does today. In fact, its current flow is flow shifted as recently as the 19th century. So it used to flow into the ocean in a place called Thatta, which is still in India actually. But now this flows further westward because of an earthquake that happened in the 19th century, and it flows into the ocean somewhere near Karachi today. So the flow of these two big rivers, and of course the ocean being higher, meant that what is now the Run of Kutch was actually water, and the climate of western India was then wetter, so what was then the Run of Kutch would have actually looked like the Sundarbans. And in this landscape, not surprisingly, there were many archaeological sites. There are today many archaeological sites, many cities rose and fell. And in fact, if you map out the Harappan sites, it is quite interesting. These are of the mature period Harappan sites. I will talk about the earlier and later periods in a subsequent slide. But if you just take the mature period Harappan sites, you can see that most of the Harappan sites are not along the Indus, but along the what is now the dry riverbed of the Ghaggar, or then was called the Saraswati River. And you can see there is some of the very big sites like Banawali and Ganeriwala, etc. along this dry riverbed. And you can see it flows then into the ocean. In fact, this is just showing one stream coming out into the Run of Kutch, but in fact it would have been more like a delta kind of places with many channels. And you can also see Dholavira, you can see many other sites as well. But this is from this period, but in fact, even this map, the person who did it didn't take into account something very interesting. He or she, whoever did it, I think Michel Danino put this together, did not account fully for the fact that ocean levels were also higher. So he's only done the river and the climate, but you need to take into account higher ocean levels, in which case Gujarat would have actually looked somewhat like this. And as you can see, in the Bronze Age, that is 4,000-5,000 years ago, Saurashtra was actually an island, Kutch was actually an island, and you can see what it all looked like. Indus coming in, the Saraswati flowing in from the north, and then suddenly all those sites make sense. You see where is Lothal? If you go to Lothal today, it's landlocked, and you wonder why on earth was there a port here? The reason is very simple. If Saurashtra was a island, then ships coming up the Gulf from Khambat from the Konkan coast would have sailed up and stopped at Lothal. Why would they have stopped at Lothal? Well, people will tell you it was a port, and there is indeed there are docks there and there is a settlement there. But if you've been to Lothal, one of the things that will strike you is that it is just too small a settlement to be a major port. It has got a very large docking area, yes, and then there are these small platforms, and then there is a couple of warehouses, but the settlement itself is small. So my theory, not accepted by all historians, but my theory is that in fact it was not a port but a customs depot. So ships coming up there stopped at Lothal, they were unloaded their stuff. People, you can imagine the Harappan Revenue Service batch of 2043 BC stood there and inspected the goods, asked for a bribe, and did a stamp, and then put them back in the ship. And then where did they go? They went up further north, where they did go to what was almost certainly a very large port, which is Dholavira. In fact, any of you who've been to Dholavira know it's a huge site, today marooned in the middle of the Run of Kutch. Now people wonder, why not would build this large settlement in place, we can't go anywhere from. But the reason is that, as I told you, sea levels higher, water coming in from two major rivers, so this was all navigable. And of course, though some of these ships were coming up from the south, but there was also another channel that you could use to go through the Gulf of Kutch, past a site that we know as Dwarka. Now Dwarka means what? It means the gateway. What was it a gateway to? Well, we know the Harappans were sailing out towards the Middle East. They would sail out to Oman, they would sail out all the way through to the Persian Gulf, to Sumeria and so on. And we know they were trading with each other because we have found a lot of things from the Harappan civilization in sites in the Middle East. They include weights and measures, they include beads, they include stamps, those seals, stamps from the seals and so on. And of course, the Sumerians have also told us about the arrival of people from the east who came to trade in things which are quite obviously Indian, things like ivory, peacocks, beads and so on. And they call these people the Meluhans. In fact, they were large enough in number, they were actually living in these settlements or enclaves in and around Sumerian cities. So this business of Indians living in the Middle East is very old, it goes back thousands of years. There were Indians living in the Middle East in those days as well. Maybe it was, even in those days it was tax-free, I don't know. And many of them were coming from these ports in Gujarat. And in all these descriptions, it also has one of these clay tablets, Sumerian clay tablets, mentions the first definitely known Indian outside of India in the context of a court case. In this court case, what happened is that a Meluhan got into a bar brawl, a drunken bar brawl, and broke the tooth of a local. So there was a case that was brought against him, and we know that he was fined a couple of silver coins for having broken this local's tooth. Now I have a theory that this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat. Now this world that I have described, of course, there were ships going out, there would also have big ships coming in. One of the big mysteries of that period is what on earth were we importing back, because there isn't anything obviously of Middle Eastern origin found at any Harappan site, not in Gujarat and anywhere else. There are things which are there from Central Asia, but they are nothing from Gujarat. So now, obviously I am assuming that we weren't going and giving them things out of charity, we must have been bringing things back. Now one of the things very likely was copper. We know that there were copper mines in Oman at this point in time, so they're very likely copper, but obviously you won't be able to tell because they were melted down and made into other copper things. So we can't tell whether it came from Oman or from K3 or wherever. So maybe that is one possibility. The other, and this is a pure theory of mine, I think they were also bringing in Arabian horses. There is some sites in the Gujarat area where horse remains have been found, but this is still controversial. But I intend to be able to get more data on this over the next few years. But today we're going to talk about the river, and I don't want to get diverted. Now, what is the interesting thing is, the Rigveda obviously mentions the Saraswati, and it also mentions a landscape or a land which was occupied by this tribe called the Bharatas. The Bharatas clearly lived next to the Saraswati River because they talk a lot about it, and they called their homeland the land of seven rivers, the Sapta Sindhu. So the question is, where was this Sapta Sindhu? Was it up north? It was somewhere along this river, but was it in the south? Was it along, up? And also, importantly, where are those seven rivers? Now, many scholars take the view that when they're talking about the Sapta Sindhu, okay, one is the Saraswati, that's obvious. The problem is that none of the chants mention any of the other six rivers. So, it's clear from the Sapta Sindhu that it mentions Saraswati as a part of the Sapta Sindhu, but it doesn't mention any of the other rivers. It's not because the other rivers didn't exist and these people didn't know. I showed you in the Nadi Stuti Siktam. They knew everything from the Ganga all the way to the rivers of Punjab and beyond. So, the question is, where was this Sapta Sindhu? Was it up north? It was somewhere along the Sapta Sindhu, but was it in the south? Was it along, up? And also, importantly, where are those seven rivers? Now, many scholars take the view that when they're talking about the Sapta Sindhu, okay, one is the Saraswati, that's obvious. The problem is that none of the chants mention any of the other rivers. It's not because the other rivers didn't exist and these people didn't know. I showed you in the Nadi Stuti Siktam. They knew everything from the Ganga all the way to the rivers of Punjab and beyond. So, This is a big mystery. Now, many scholars think this must be the Saraswati plus 5 rivers of Punjab plus Indus. Now, I think that is not true from the internal evidence of the Rig Veda itself, because it states the following in book 7. I've given you again the details, where it says, "Coming together glorious, loudly roaring Saraswati, mother of floods, the seventh with copious milk, with fair streams strongly flowing, fully swelled by the volume of their waters." Now, what I think this describes is that all of these rivers are coming together. In other words, these 7 rivers, or rather the 6 rivers, are actually the tributaries of the Saraswati, i.e. these are all coming in. Now, there is some evidence that the Sutlej and the Yamuna at a very early stage used to also flow into the Saraswati. But now we have found bit more dating of that it is unlikely by the time that the Rig Veda was composed, the Sutlej and the Yamuna were flowing in. They most likely have moved away by this point in time. So the question then arises, what are these other 6 rivers? Are there such six others that are described? So my own sense of this is, and I'll give you a little shortly, is that basically you're not only dealing with a river, with the river Ghaggar, you're also dealing with a bunch of rivers that were flowing into it in Haryana. So you're dealing with a river system which includes the tributaries of the Saraswati alone. You're not dealing with the rivers of Punjab, you're not dealing with the Indus. That would mean that the landscape, i.e. the homeland of the Bharatas, was a very small area, which makes sense. It was a small tribe, which was basically dealing with what is modern Haryana and a little bit of the surrounding area of eastern Punjab and maybe some of northern Rajasthan. That is the area you are dealing with. And as I will show you, it is corroborated by the Mahabharata. Because in the Mahabharata, in book 9 of the Shalya Parva, chapter 38, it mentions Balram going on a tirth. Because Balram, as you know, was Lord Krishna's elder brother. He did not participate in the Kurukshetra war because he said it would end in utter disaster, and he decided to go on a pilgrimage along the Saraswati River. So he goes along the Saraswati River and he mentions the Sapta Saraswat. So he says, "O king, the 7 Saraswatis cover this universe. They are the 7 forms of Saraswati." So he gives the names of those tributaries. They are Suparva, Kanjanakshi, Vishala, Manorama, Ughavati, Surenu, and Vimaladurga. All of these 7 forms then come together, join together in the Tirtha where Baladev came. So he talks about that these rivers are coming together. Again, proof that these tributaries were coming together. And because the 7 mingle together in this spot, therefore the Tirtha is known on earth as the Sapta Saraswati. So it's very clear that this is again dealing with tributaries of the Saraswati and nothing else. Unfortunately, there are many such paleo channels dried paleo channels going into the Ghaggar in Haryana even today, including one which goes past Kurukshetra. And the Mahabharata tells us what the name of that particular one is. It says the Saraswati full of celestial water appears in Kurukshetra under the name of Oghavati. So of all of these 6 names, Oghavati was the one that was flowing past Kurukshetra. So if you've been to Kurukshetra, there is still a kund there, which is part of that paleo channel. Now, the question is, why is this landscape of the Sapta Sindhu, and why is this river Saraswati that became later on the goddess of knowledge, why are they so important? So in order to understand this, you need to understand the only political event that we clearly know of from the Rig Veda. This is the earliest known political event of Indian history. And in this, what happens is that the Bharata tribe, at some point in time, again we cannot date it, at one point in time it had a chieftain called Sudas. And Sudas and he had a guru or Rishi Vasishtha, they were attacked by an alliance of 10 tribes from the west. It is called the Battle of 10 Kings. So an alliance of 10 tribes coming in from the west challenged the Bharatas. So the Bharatas got on their horses, etc. They crossed the Saraswati towards the west, and there was a great battle on the bank in eastern Punjab on the banks of the Ravi, in and around roughly where Lahore is today. And in that battle, the Bharatas completely destroyed and defeated the alliance of 10 tribes. In fact, there are descriptions of how the enemy soldiers trying to escape from the battlefield were drowned in the Ravi as a result of the strong flow of water. So having done this, obviously the Bharatas gained an empire. This is the first known empire of Indian history. They then turned eastward and seemed to have defeated another tribe of chieftain whose name was Bheda on the banks of the Yamuna. So now they had obviously a fairly large territory going from eastern Punjab at least, if not beyond, going across Haryana all the way to western UP. And then, of course, Sudas did another thing. He then conducted the first known Ashwamedha Yajna and Rajasuya Yajna, and then named himself the Chakravartin. Chakravartin means he whose wheel can go in any direction. So he became the great monarch. But is this why we today call ourselves the Bharatas? Are we naming ourselves after this empire? Well, partly yes. But it is more about what the Bharatas did next, which is quite significant. What they did is, you see, whenever a tribe defeats another tribe, they will say, we have defeated you, our gods are therefore bigger than your gods, more powerful than your gods, therefore you should worship our gods. And they impose their gods on the loser. But that is not what the Bharatas did. Instead, what they did, they seem to have conducted some sort of a conference of all the wise people of all the defeated tribes, all the rishis of tribes they were just happened to be in contact with, and got them together and compiled all their ideas. This compilation is what we now know as the Vedas. Okay? And then, having done that, they did something also interesting. They said that we will create a common pool of gods and worship. We will all worship everybody's gods. And we know this because the very last chant of the Rig Veda clearly states this contract. It is our civilizational contract, in which essentially they say that all the ancient gods have a place around the sacrificial fire. So we will come together as a people. And by doing this, they trigger what we now know as Indic civilization. So here is the Rig Veda, book 10, where it states, assemble, speak together, let your mind be of one accord. As ancient gods unanimously sat around their appropriate share, this place is common the assembly, common the mind, so be your thoughts united. A common purpose do I lay before you and worship your general oblation. One and same be your resolve and be your minds of one accord. United be the thoughts of all, that all may happily agree. Now this is a very powerful idea. You're giving all the gods a place around the fire. And this powerful idea spread. So as these people came in contact with other people, they contributed their gods, they got a place around the fire, and they accepted everybody else's gods. And in this way, the idea spread. Now I come from Bengal, so does Vinayak from Far East. I'm assuming at some point this idea reached Bengal. Maybe we contributed Durga and Kali and others to the common pool, we accepted everybody else's. And that is how I, from the Far East, call myself by the name of a Haryanvi tribe, a Bharata. Because we accepted this idea. And this idea was so powerful that everybody called ourselves the entire country as the land of the 7 rivers. So later on, in the Puranic times, which is many thousand years, a couple of thousand years later, we would call all of India as the land of 7 rivers. For what we did then was replace the 7 rivers which were just the tributaries of the Saraswati. We then began, now you do ritual bathing, and before any puja, etc., if you do ritual bathing, there is a chant. It goes Gange cha Yamunai chaiva, so on. It has 7 rivers, and all those 7 rivers includes the Ganga, the Yamuna. It still remembers the Saraswati, which is no longer in existence. Then Godavari, Kaveri, Narmada, Sindhu, and so on. So 7 rivers, but it now covers the subcontinent. Haryana, of course, is not forgotten entirely. Much later, we still remember it as the land between the Saraswati and the Drishatwati. Drishatwati is again another dry riverbed which even today flows into the Ghaggar. We now know of it as the Chautan. And the land between the Drishatwati and the Saraswati is, roughly speaking, today's Haryana, is known in the ancient text as Brahmavarta. And here we go, how India is now known as the land of 7 rivers. The Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari, Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, Kaveri rivers, may all your waters come together and cleanse me. This is in the Purana. Again, the exact reference is given. Now, let me show you present day drainage systems and paleo drainage systems in the plains of Haryana. So as you can see, there is of course the main line, that is the Saraswati, that goes all the way, which I showed you the green line from before. And then there are 3 lines. You can see the wide one, which is the blue one, which was the original, in the very beginning, Yamuna flowed through that, clearly into the Saraswati, which is why the Saraswati would have been a very major river. It then shifted somewhat south to Y2, which is the red, the first red, and then later on, much later, it then swung out to Y3 into the Ganga. But even when it swung to the Ganga, it didn't flow through the channel we know today. Yes, it used to flow past Delhi, but then further down it used to flow more close to Bharatpur and then swing through the Chambal back into the Ganga. So that was the original flow. So why I'm telling you all of this is so that you have a sense that the landscape we live in is a living landscape. It continuously goes through changes all the time. Now, again, let me tell you about the Saraswati. It is in the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, it documents the fact that by the time Balram went on his walk, the river was already dying. So not only do we know from Balram's Tirth that there were all these other rivers flowing into it, he also tells us that by the time, so you have, for example, in the earlier part of the thing, it talks about the sacred Saraswati, the foremost of the river. It talks about courses towards the ocean, to the, truly the first of all streams. So there is a clear memory of it flowing all the way. But by the time you come towards the end, the Kurukshetra war is happening, we are also told that it is drying up and it is going into the going into the desert, and the point at which it dries up into the desert, that place is called Vinashana. So again, Mahabharata 9:34, Balram found the Saraswati is already underground. He traveled to this place called Vinashana, where the Saraswati is completely invisible and lost. So that is the legend of where we get this idea. Now, the question is, what are the timelines of this river? What do we know from geological studies about when did this river come, when did it flow, and so on? So now we have, and I've given you again source, this is A. Chatterjee on the existence of, this is a paper from Nature Search Scientific Reports, published in 2019. It's very interesting because it tells us that this river didn't just flow and then dry up. It went through many cycles before this happened. So, between the year, from 80,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago, that is before the Ice Age, this was a big perennial river. It flowed down from the higher Himalayan glaciers, and both the Yamuna and the Sutlej flowed into it. So in this very early stage, it was a massive, powerful river. In fact, may have been the most prominent river in northern India at that time, more important than either the Ganga or the Indus. Very big river. But then what happens is that climate changes with the ice age. Things become very cold, the glaciers freeze up completely, so they're not melting enough, and there is a clear decline. Meanwhile, the monsoons fail, and between 20,000 and 9,000 years ago, it is basically a small rain-fed river flowing just out of the Shivaliks. So it's still flowing, but it's clearly not so important. Then what happens is, 9,000 years ago, the world begins warming up again. The monsoons strengthen, and the amount of rainfall is much higher than it is today. So the monsoons were much stronger. Northwestern India was much wetter than you see it today. The Thar was wet. As I told you, Gujarat would have looked a bit like the Sundarbans. And we know this from multiple sources, but one of the obvious ones, which you can easily verify, is that go and look at the Harappan seals. You will see, after all, Harappans are from northwestern India, and it's full of animals that are clearly from wet climate. It has tigers, but it doesn't have lions. You think of today of Gujarat as about its lions, but there are no lions. There are tigers in there. It has rhinoceros, which is today found in Bengal, and you find them in Assam. We don't find rhinos in Punjab and Gujarat and so on. It of course has elephants and so on. So these are all wet country animals. You have crocodiles and so on. So clearly, during this period, 9,000 to 4,500 years ago, 4,500 years ago is 2,500 BC, you're already into the Harappan period. This is the period during which there is rain, but there is a difference between this period when the revival happens and the previous period. Because by this point, the Yamuna has clearly moved away. So when the Saraswati revives after the Ice Age, the Yamuna does not flow into it. And possibly at some point the Satluj too stops flowing into it. So you are dealing with a river that does not have the Satluj, it does not have the Yamuna, and it appears does not even have glacial melt, because the glacial melt is flowing out towards the Yamuna and out. But it is still a very big river. So people tend to have this mental image that big rivers are somehow always glacier-driven rivers. Not the case. Most of the great rivers of the world, the Nile, the Amazon, these are all rain-fed rivers. So you can have very large rivers which are rain-fed, and this was the case. This was a large rain-fed, very powerful but large rain-fed river, and it was possible because northwestern India was very wet. Now what happens is around about 4,500 years ago, that is 2,500 BC, we clearly begin to see the climate begin to change, initially slowly. The river begins to slowly dry up. Now this is interesting because this is when the peak of the Harappan civilization happens. People have a mental idea that the peak of something must happen during when the best possible conditions were there. In fact, that is not the case at all. Most great civilizations actually grow under times of stress. And so this is also the case here. Actually, the great cities appear during some sort of a sweet spot when it was wet enough to sustain a large population, but dry enough that it was forcing people to not live wherever they want, but they required civic organization. And that is the circumstances in which the great Harappan cities rose. The river was already in deep stress during that time. And then, around 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago, there were widespread droughts. Now this didn't only happen in India, this happened all over the world. You saw the old dynasty Egypt collapse. You have descriptions of what happens in the Sumerian cuneiform texts. The giraffe civilization in Iran collapsed, and the mature Harappans also collapsed. These cities were abandoned, people moved. The later Harappan sites are much smaller, and I will talk about what they did as they went about this phase. Now, just so that you get a sense of how this all works in images, you have this is a timeline. It starts from the bottom and goes up. Yeah. So you have initially the pre-Harappan phase. So there, by the way, there are some sub-phases as well. So there is a phase right in the beginning, the pre-Harappan phase, which is 9,000 to 5,800. This is, the rains have returned after the Ice Age, but they are not as strong as they will be in the subsequent period. So you have a big monsoon phase, and you have these pre-Harappan sites that are popping up. We are finding more and more of them, so it's likely that there are much more of them than the 4 or 5 that I put on the screen, because quite a few of them are now being discovered in Haryana and so on. But you can see they're in and around, as I can show you, the Saraswati River. They are not along the Indus. Now what happens is you now move out between 5,800 to 4,600. This is called the early Harappan phase. And you can see, again, SS is Saraswati. And along that, most of the sites are popping up in Haryana, northern Rajasthan, and those are the dots that you can get, which are the purple dots. Now notice these sites. My sense is that this is the period that the Rig Veda describes. Okay? This is a settled community, but the very large Harappan cities have not been built. This is important because, contrary to some colonial era historians, the Rig Veda does not describe a pastoral society or a herding society at all. They have their cities, they are clearly settled, they are describing a settled landscape, but they have not yet built the big cities. But there are cities in the Rig Veda. In fact, Indra is known as in some of the charts as a destroyer of forts. So clearly there were cities, and you can see that they are mostly in Haryana. But the important part is that actually along this dry riverbed of the Saraswati. So as I said, we have this text which clearly describes a civilization, and we have a river that it seems to describe as well, and we have a whole bunch of sites that are exactly where you want to be. So I have never understood how people deny that there is some sort of a link between the Vedic people and the Harappan people. My own sense is that we are dealing with the early Harappan people. Now what happens is, up to a certain point, at some point, the mature Harappan period begins to happen. This is during, the initial phase of that is during the strong monsoon phase, but then some point, while these big cities are still growing, the monsoon begins to weaken around about 4,000 years ago, that's 2000 BC. And then what happens is that this civilization basically collapses. People abandon these big cities, they move out, some of them move, the bulk of them move out, it seems, up towards the Shivaliks. These rivers were still clearly, the monsoon was strong enough to allow them to flow, but like today's, you know how the Ghaggar is, it flows some of the distance and then stops. So they were taking, basically, as it dried up, they were kind of following it further and further up. But these are all small sites. For some reason, which we don't know, there is also a cluster of these sites in the middle of the Thar Desert. But they're still along the dry riverbed. Now some people have postulated that this river did not any longer flow to the ocean, which we know it didn't. What it probably had was an inland delta where the water went and kind of created these lakes, etc. So it's possible that is why they were there. This is controversial, I do not know, but we do have all these sites in what is now the India-Pakistan border. Now, what is interesting is that ancient Indians were very aware of the changing climate, sea levels, rivers, landscape. Our ancient texts, whether the Vedic text and all subsequent texts, clearly talk about water, changing landscape. They're obsessed about water in many places. And you can see that repeatedly. Even in the Rig Veda itself, what is the great feat of Indra himself? Why is he such a great god? That's because he defeats the dragon, Viritra. And what is the bad thing Viritra has done? Why should he be punished? Because he has built a dam to hold back the waters. So what does Indra do? So Indra basically kills the dragon Viritra, destroys his stone dam, and sets the water free. So he was obviously an anti-dam campaigner of some sort. But you have other examples as well. You have the king Manu. King Manu seemed to have ruled over a king. He was the king of the Dravidas, somewhere in southern India, evidently. There is still a river along which his kingdom is supposed to be, which is in Tamil Nadu. And then what happens is that Vishnu in the form of Matsya Avatar comes and warns him of a great flood that is coming. So this great flood happens, very similar to the story of Noah. And in that flood, everything is drowned. And then at the end of that, however, because Matsya Avatar had warned him, and Manu had built this great ship, he had taken the 7 sages. He had taken, like Noah, seeds, animals, etc. And then at the end of the great flood, he re-establishes civilization at the foot of the mountains and along the river Saraswati. So maybe, I don't know, we can't guess exactly who it was. Maybe it was a South Indian whose lands got washed away with the great flood, which we know happened around 7,000, 8,000 years ago. At the end of the last ice age, we do see massive flooding happening across the world. So it's possible that this is a memory of the great flood. And at the end of it, he sails up the Saraswati and re-establishes civilization. I don't know, but at the very least we can see that there is a memory of some sort of a cataclysmic event, which is there in the memories of almost every ancient civilization. So we of course know the story of Noah. The Mesopotamians, Babylonians, they also had a story of Gilgamesh, which also talks about the great flood. Then there are many other, you talk of any, the Chinese, the Southeast Asian, you talk about any ancient civilization, even the Aborigines of Australia have a story about the great flood. So, again, we can debate whether they're talking about the same flood or not. These are difficult to say, but again, there is this very strong sense of a changing landscape. Similarly, Iron Age texts of a later periods also talk about the disappearance of the Saraswati. We obviously discussed it earlier in the context of the Mahabharata and Balram's voyage, but you also have the Ganga, which is then brought back by Bhagirath. Right? So there is the story of how Bhagirath goes and brings back the Ganga from the heavens, and in fact, one of the main sources of it, the very upper reaches, is still called Bhagirathi. So Bhagirath and the story. So again, the idea that this river is brought back to life. There is the story of the flooding of Krishna's Dwarka. There is the story of Parashuram who retakes the Konkan Malabar coast from the ocean. There is the story of how there was a great flood and that the 7 temples of Mahabalipuram were flooded. So today when you go to the shore temple in Mahabalipuram, there is one temple, but the legend is that there were 6 other temples. And again, just to show you that maybe we should take some of these ancient stories a little more seriously. When the big tsunami happened about 15 years ago, in Aceh in Indonesia, before the floods came, the waters came in, the waters actually withdrew several kilometers. And when it did, suddenly these spires of these ancient temples popped up in the horizon. And of course, the fishermen of the area said, of course we know they are there because our fishing nets keep getting caught in them. So suddenly we discovered that actually there were indeed all these other temples that were indeed flooded. And so since then, of course, Navy divers have gone there, taken photos. There are now some amount of research has been done. Now my point here for the purposes today is just to tell you that irrespective of today's climate change debate, you have to understand that we live in a living landscape. And you have to respect that living landscape because it is continuously changing. Our coastlines are changing, our rivers are changing, our climate is changing, and all of these have had catastrophic impact on previous rounds of our civilization. Even Hastinapur, incidentally, which was the capital of the Kauravas, of the Pandavas, of the Kuru tribe, after the battle, a few generations after the battle of Kurukshetra, was also destroyed by a flood. And they would transfer themselves and they would go down the river of Ganga and re-establish themselves in what is now Prayagraj area. Now, since all of these kinds of movements are going on, how did the ancients try and remember it? Now, again, I'll give you some of my theories, you can take them as you wish. It is quite interesting, Indians have actually, one is to remember them in texts, stories and so on. But there are other ways in which we remember them too. And we have kept it alive even today. So for example, what do we do when we migrate out of India? How do we remember about our roots? So for example, when in the 19th century, people from eastern UP and Bihar went as indentured labor to Mauritius, what did they do? How did they keep alive their traditions? They took with them a pot of Ganga Jal. And when they arrived in Mauritius, they found a large lake. And they poured all the water into that lake and they called it Ganga Talab. So symbolically, this Ganga Talab is now considered to be as sacred as the Ganga itself. So all the rituals that were to be done to the Ganga are now done by the Mauritian Hindus to Ganga Talab. Right? Now, here comes my conjecture. It is very interesting, I think, that as the river Saraswati dried up, and you see these migrations, of course some migrations happened up towards the Shivaliks, we also have evidence of them moving onto the Gangetic plains. And many of them then settled into these areas. Now it's very important to remember these are not empty areas, there were other civilizations already there. They were quite evolved. We tend to overstate just the Harappans, but in fact there were other parallel civilizations already in existence in India. Some of them were very evolved, they were warlike. In fact, in Sanyal we have discovered chariots from this civilization, so they were quite warlike bunch. But I think what they would have done, just like the Mauritians, they would have taken a pot of water from the Saraswati as it was dying, and they would have gone to where the Yamuna and the Ganga meet and poured it in. So that is why we say that the Saraswati flows there. I don't think it literally means that the Saraswati flows there. All that they are doing is that they are saying that memory of this river still flows here, that civilization still flows here. And of course, every 12 years, we celebrate a fair, a festival there called the Kumbh Mela. What is a Kumbh? It's a pot of water. So that is my interpretation of what the Kumbh Mela is. There are of course other legends about it, but that is my interpretation of what it is. Now, how did the Harappans deal with the climate change as it was happening? Well, we know in Dholavira, as this place began to dry up, it was a major port, they had lots of resources, they began to invest in water storage. So for example, they built these large reservoirs all on three sides of Dholavira town. You have these huge reservoirs, which I can show you there. Even today, by the way, in the monsoons right now, if you go, you'll find some water there. It collects even today. But as they may have done this, unfortunately, this did not save them. Why? Because one, Gujarat is very dry, so it kept drying further and further. But together with this, the sea level also fell. So don't think sea levels only rise because climate change, they can also fall because of climate change. And so what happened is that Dholavira ended up getting marooned in the middle of what is now the Rann of Kutch. So as the sea level fell, you got these salt flats. And there was no fresh water coming in, there was no seawater coming in, so you got these white colored salt flats. So by the way, if you go to Dholavira, it's very interesting. You should go not just to the site, but to, you can call the shoreline of this island. It's not an island in the middle of water, it's an island of these salt flats, Khadir Island. And you will see in fact, it has everything. It has a beach and everything, those kinds, just as if there was water there. And so what happens is, Dholavira basically has to be abandoned. Because not only do they not have water, they can't function as a port anymore because the ocean is gone. And so they all begin to disperse out of these great cities into these smaller and smaller settlements, which I said were in the Himalayan foothills or migrating into the Gangetic plains. We also see other things. We see clear changes in cropping patterns in the Indus-Saraswati area 4,000 years ago as the Harappans began to adapt to the weaker southwest monsoon. So what did they do? The peak monsoon, the peak period, the Harappans used to eat wheat, barley, even rice, although rice is more of a Gangetic plain crop, but still. Mostly wheat and barley. These are water consuming crops. As the situation changes, we can clearly see they begin to change to weather resistant millets like jowar, bajra, ragi. Yeah? And these would interestingly remain the main crops of northwest India till the 20th century. Much of northwest India today grows and eats wheat. But in fact, wheat was considered till just beyond living memory, to maybe our great-grandfather's generation. It was considered a luxury crop. So, you grew it, maybe, you had festival food. Even in Bengal, even today, luchi, it's a festival food. It's not what you generally ate. You ate bajri, you ate jowar, these kinds of things were the commonly eaten food. You also see them shift from monoculture to mixed cropping. So not only are they not growing wheat and barley as much, they also grow multiple crops in the same general area. Why are they doing this? Because they are trying to hedge against. So they all, so earlier you had big fields growing only wheat, growing only bajra. The farmers in these smaller settlements, they are growing all kinds of different things because at least one of them will happen and won't starve. So what can we learn from the ancients? Well, if we are going to go through climate change and it's going to do bad things. Now I want to say right in the beginning that climate change is a very difficult thing to predict, including what exactly it will do. So very often you have these activists who are absolutely certain that this is going to lead to X, Y, Z outcomes. The sea level will rise exactly by this much, and monsoons will fail, and this will happen. Weather systems are very complex systems. When they break down, it's like a top, right? Supposing you have a top that is spinning, you knock it, it will wobble. It is not possible, no matter how good your supercomputers are, to actually predict how it will wobble and exactly which side it will fall. So there will be, when this thing begins wobbling, let me tell you, many things will happen for some time, will happen for some other time. Where it will all go is very, very difficult to predict. And this may happen irrespective of human intervention, by the way. Even if human beings didn't exist, this would happen. So this is something we should take into account. But it does mean that we need to revisit our current approach and our current agricultural policies, which are way too much emphasis on growing wheat and rice. Yeah. So today, for example, Punjab grows rice, which it never grew. Even in Harappan times when it was raining properly, it was not growing rice in any quantity. It was growing wheat, but it was basically one round crop. It was have another crop which would be something else. So in northwestern India, we need to get serious about changing the incentive structure that we today have about the kinds of things we grow. We also need to bring back millets into our diet. We need to grow a lot more of these millets. Not only are they more healthy for a variety of reasons, they are much, much more resilient. Second, urbanization is inevitable with development, so I'm not of the belief that somehow we should try and slow it down. It's inevitable. But we should look at greater dispersal of settlements across the country and not try to bring everybody into these mega problems, because this water issue is going to become a serious issue. It also means, interestingly, that medium and smaller towns, especially in water-rich eastern India. Okay. Third, the preservation of water bodies and waste management has to be a priority in the next round of infrastructure investment. This is very, very important. There's infra vision, so this is something totally important. I mean, Delhi, for example, has amazing water channels which are naturally there. This place has had many cities built on it in the same site, going back to, of course, Indraprastha, but since then many cities have been built. And all those who built cities here were very conscious about this water issue. So there's House Khas, there is many others, and they paid a great deal of attention to the landscape and the water channels. So even today, Delhi has all these water channels going across. You look, when you go past the Prime Minister's house, you'll see one of them. Defense Colony has one of them. Unfortunately, somebody has gone and now built a car park on top of it. But these channels are absolutely essential to allow this water flow. Unfortunately, thanks to a certain Le Corbusier, we have this very Cartesian view and of ideal of what a city needs to be. Now, if those roads are not exactly straight, then it's bad. Actually, good city building is about taking into account the natural landscape and building for it. That may not always allow you to have those nice straight roads. And Le Corbusier's soul may not particularly be thrilled about, all those curves in the things. But as I always say, the Harappans had very straight roads. They abandoned them. And where did they go and live? In Varanasi. And Varanasi, it turns out to be, is just as old as Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and so on. It's a city that has been around from about that period, and it is still around. So, for whatever it's worth, messy, squiggly roads can sometimes be perhaps more efficient if they take into account the water part. And even today, you can go and to Varanasi, you will be amazed. There is still, unfortunately, dying, but the remnants of it are there, of an amazing water system that is there underneath it, which has been there from Kushan times at least, maybe even older. So, if you go to Varanasi, this has these series of tirthas inside Varanasi. And those tirthas, tirth by the way literally means water, they are a part of a water and sewage system. What was there in functioning till as recently as the 20th century. It has now been badly disrupted, but that's a different matter. But even today, those who are doing serious pilgrimages still follow some of the contours of it. And one part of it is, interestingly, the names by which Varanasi is named. Varanasi is actually the city between two rivers. One of them is Varuna and the other is Asi. So if you go there, unfortunately, Varuna river is still sort of looks like a river. Asi is unfortunately a nala. Literally, the locals call it Asi Nala. So we have disrupted that water system which survived from the Bronze Age till today. And there's some attempt today, very recently, to try and revive the Asi water area. With that, let me stop and hand it back to you, Vinayak.
Thank you. That was brilliant. And I reiterate my point in the introduction when I called you Delhi Renaissance man. It's a label that's now going to stick with you. But this has been it's a topic that we don't discuss normally. Our daily conversations around the drawing rooms and stuff are what. But these are mind-blowing subjects which connect so many threads of religion, geography, climate change. You've done a brilliant job. Thank you for this. I think it's made for a very illuminating evening for all of us. And I've been seeing faces around the audience. But now you have Sanjeev Sanyal to ask questions. It's 8:08, and is it all right if we have a question hour that goes on till 8:30, quarter to 9?
Yeah.
So for those of you who are interested, please feel free to ask Sanjeev anything. I know we have a very young man, Mr. Deva. Where is he? He is working for the Department of Archaeology of Haryana State, and he is currently doing archaeology work on discovering more Harappan sites. Am I right? So you've got a living, I mean, it's not just
He's a pre-Harappan site expert, right?
Okay. So I think you have the right to ask the first question.
Thank you, sir.
Push here.
Hang on.
Introduce yourself. Just tell us a little of what you're doing.
Hi everyone, my name is Kush. I work with the Department of Archaeology in Museums, Haryana. And this is my second interaction with Sanjeev sir, though on a very, very, very different topic. Sanjeev sir, first of all, being an archaeologist in the government, I think thank you very much for having a very lucid and a very non-controversial conversation on this topic, which usually raises a lot of eyebrows, and I think you handled the whole conversation very well, which actually says a lot about you, and thank you. Especially on a weekend, I did not want a controversy on horse. So I think you brought it up really nicely, and I know that a lot of Harappan sites in Surkotada have brought bones of Icus asinus or Icus caballus, which we called nomenclature of horse type. Yes, like you rightly said, a lot needs to be done in identifying. One more thing, you are absolutely quite right. Like Khetri mines have shown that, you know, those probably were not the main source of copper for Harappans. However, in government now we have been told to use Sindhu Saraswati rather than use Harappans or Indus Saraswati. But and a lot of Americans have done their research on trans-Himalayan copper sources and identifying them. And thank you for introducing words like Juroft and other civilizations in the Near East like Bactromargiana complex in the present-day Afghanistan, the Halil River, that is Juroft. My question to you is, have you tried to understand, or have you gone deeper into understanding the fact that, I mean, we have enough evidence of riverine or water transportation between various Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, contemporary civilizations. However, not much has been talked about when it comes to via land. I mean, when it comes to India, the buck stops at Silk Route, and the period that we are dealing with is a lot older than the Silk Route.
Yeah. So, the important thing to remember is that the landscape we are dealing with is totally different. Northwestern India is very wet. But also remember that Balochistan is actually a grassland. So you can actually walk across it. You see, our entire mental image of ancient India is unfortunately driven by today's landscape. So if you go back to ancient times and you think of Balochistan as a grassland, and then it changes many things, because first of all you could walk through it. Okay, it wasn't like, you know, our view of it, you know, Alexander got lost in Balochistan and his army got destroyed. That's kind of our vision. Or when we go and look up today we see all those dry landscapes. But in fact, ancient humans, even when they came out of Africa, they actually, when they came to India, they walked through Balochistan. So since Balochistan was kind of wet, it means that many of the links through have to take this into account. For example, Jiroft in Iran was a continuation of the same civilization. You know, they have the humped bull, for example, which is there in India. And by the way, the humped bull is very much an Indian origin beast. And we can clearly see that this is, Iran is at the area where there is an interaction between the Middle Eastern culture and the Indic culture. And so, there is, you're right, there is continuity. There's obviously the maritime links as well. Now here, let me tell you something again, something I have researched, which is about the Battle of Ten Kings. Now one of the tribes in the Battle of Ten Kings, that gets defeated is called the Parasas. Okay, they're a western tribe that comes and gets defeated. And interestingly, after this, they are not mentioned anywhere. So, this is a theory, we can all debate it. But it's very interesting that we end up with, of course, a very Vedic linked culture turning up in eastern Iran called also the Parasas or Persians, we know them, form the area, the province that is called Fars. If you look up a map, it is in eastern Iran. And of course, they speak a language at that time, which is called Avestan, which is almost identical to Rig Veda. The Rig Vedic Sanskrit or Rig Vedic Bhasha and Avestan Bhasha are exactly the same, but for a linguistic shift, which is that there are 2 or 3 shifts, but the main one is the sound sa becomes ha. Interestingly, this happens in modern Assamese as well. Yeah. So therefore, it's interesting. The Western texts, which are the most ancient of the Zoroastrian texts, mentions the Harahwati, which is Saraswati. It mentions the Hapta Hindu, which is Sapta Sindhu. And it also mentions that this is a land that originally used to worship the Ahura, which is Asura, but now it has been taken over by the Devas. So possibly there was some sort of a religious dispute between the worshippers of the Devas and the worshippers of the Asuras. Now this is also interesting in the context of the Rig Veda, because in the Rig Veda, the Asuras and the Devas are both worshipped. There is no connotation of good and bad. So Varuna, who is a god, is an Asura. Rudra is an Asura. So there were just 2 sets of gods. They were not good and bad, the later connotation. For whatever reason, in India the connotation became Devas good, Asuras bad. You have an exact mirror image in the Western texts. The Ahura Mazda, the great Asura, is good. His enemy is Angaramanyu, the leader of the Devas. So this dichotomy somehow exists even to this day in Persian texts. And so, but otherwise, there was this culture that they were linked with. So the point, going back to your point, yes, there were land links and possibly the links through to the Giraffe, which are basically in eastern area. And we do have a few Harappan sites which are also very close to the Giraffe, like Sikta Tenjor Dor. I think that's how it's pronounced. Sikta Tendor, which is at the Baloch Iran border. If you look at it, the Giraffe and this are right next to each other, and also next to the sea. So they were probably either walking across or they were going by ocean route.
Next, anybody? Yes, you have a question here, you have a question there. So you first, then we come to you. Introduce yourself so we know.
Hello, my name is Mandar. I'm a UPSC aspirant. I'm not sure if you like it.
I don't approve of that, but
I know that. That's why I was mentioned
Social media.
yeah.
Oh, but I might add.
An activity I don't approve of, but I'll forgive you.
I might add that I'm a fashion graduate. I went to IFT.
Okay.
I worked in industry for 4 years.
So actually you did something useful with your life. Wonderful.
I did, and I then decided to take a break.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay.
history is one of my optional subjects. That's what brought me to the talk. And thank you so much for it. I did not study history academically from the academic sense.
Makes 2 of us.
And so I could sort of relate to the talk, but this was sort of news to me from this is not what we study in our regular history books. My question to you is, the academic history looks at Indus Valley civilization and then the Rig Veda and then the later Vedic age. Do you think that we are sort of doing it wrongly? Do you think that the Indus Valley is actually overlapping with the Rigvedic period and the timelines? Because
Yes.
there's a argument.
Yeah.
Sorry, once again, there's this argument. If you could also address that Indus Valley civilization has no literary records, and the Rigvedic age has no archaeological records. So, do you think?
So it's like this. You have one set of sources which there's a literary source which is clearly dealing with the same landscape, and you have a whole bunch of archaeological sites which don't have a literature. Now, it doesn't require great imagination to make the argument that they may have something to do with each other. The question is, where do you place it? So, as I try to make the case, that look, the easiest way to make this case is to look at what the evidence is. The evidence is that there was a river. It is mentioned in the Rig Veda, clearly flowing from the mountains to the ocean. We have geological studies which clearly state that this would have had to be before 4,500 years ago. Before, or possibly well before, because by the time the mature period comes, that river was already drying up. So it is very clear to me that the Rigvedic period is before the mature Harappan period. It is also dealing with the fact that most of these early Harappan sites are along this river, which is also, so again doesn't require too much imagination to think that maybe it is describing the early Harappans or even pre-Harappans. Yeah? Now, so once you have got that clarified, the rest of it flows. It's not so difficult because the later period text is mentioning this river is dying out, right? By the time the Mahabharata is happening, the river has already dried. You're probably dealing with an Iron Age civilization by this point, and yes, iron by this point does exist. So they are talking about earlier people who existed, that the river Ganga had disappeared, it came back. Because remember, when the Mahabharata is being done by Vyas, he's talking about all of these other things as happened long time ago. These are not from his time. He's saying many generations ago, there was this king called Bharata, there was this events happened. So he is also talking about history. And by the time Balram comes, Saraswati is dead. So the histories he's talking about, and in those he describes great kings, great cities. So my view is that he's describing the great Harappan cities. That is the only way in which this can be linked through. And the Puranic texts have king lists. Those king lists are very long. They are not short king lists. And if you allowing for a little bit here and there, you can clearly see that you could be dealing with very early lists, some of which deal with these. Now, importantly remember, none of these texts are book of history or geography. The Rig Veda is not a book of geography. So, not surprisingly, it doesn't deal with describing it in totality, because it's dealing with some other thing. It's like would be the case that if you attempted to work out the geography of the Roman Empire by reading the Bible. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that the Romans didn't exist then, we do. They're occasionally mentioned in the Bible, Pontius Pilate, etc. But you would get very vague references, you wouldn't be able to work it out. So that is where we are at. So it is not surprising that it is vague. But you can see that it is not too difficult to see that they have something to do with each other. And we now have geological and other evidences, satellite image, etc., archaeological digs, etc., which allows you to more or less fit these things together. So my sense, given current information, the best fit is Rig Veda is early Harappan.
Thank you. You have got a question from the gentleman there. Please introduce yourself and your question.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a very insightful discussion. So to put it very simply, I'm an early career economist who's turned disillusionist over 4 years. And
that also makes two of us. So I have grave suspicion of my own profession. If you thought I was suspicious of civil servants, you should see my opinions on economists.
Sir, so basically my question is a multi-pronged question. Having stepped back, as this is a talk that has been put together by a firm or perhaps a think tank that specializes in infra-related matters. I would like to begin with by asking if given the current pollution levels in the country, would the mystical river Saraswati would want to make a comeback? Secondly, you being someone who has the privilege, or rather the credentials to rub shoulders with the who's who in the political and in the government, right? Would you really? I mean, if I may put it very simply, if we were to go ahead and solve the Saraswati River, mystery, or just about any contesting claims on and around it, would it really go on to create something that would solve for our current problems, or would it sort of lead to another river traffic jam leading up to the festivities?
Well, I don't know if reviving the Saraswati would solve anything. We are, I don't think it's going to happen easily, although there is now an effort to divert some part of the Sutlej waters into this river channel. So maybe it'll flow in a certain sort of sense. But as a grand strategy for reviving the Saraswati as a way of reviving India, I don't know whether, I haven't thought about it that way. But let me say that I personally, the reason I'm interested in it was simply to see what did people do under times of stress. And it's very clear to me that a civilization survives if it is flexible. So if it requires us to rethink the way, for example, our agriculture works, then we need to have a serious talk about it. We cannot be held hostage to the politics of it. For example, the farm laws. I literally do not know any economist, agronomist, etc., who does not think those farm laws needed to be changed. Now, obviously, it couldn't be changed because the political Overton window didn't allow it. But I think we still need to think about what is sensible to be done. Eventually, we using enormous amounts of resources effectively to fund the growing of rice in Punjab, which should be grown there. Then we actually subsidize that, and then it creates these leaves, and that also, it's not natural rice, it's all kinds of, genetically modified stuff, such that the local cattle don't even want to eat the husk. So we then burn it. So we are actually in a bizarre situation. We are growing too much of wheat, which we don't need so much of, in order to leave behind stubble, which even the cattle don't want to eat. And then subsidizing ultimately the air quality we breathe through much of November. This has got to be the most absurd set of policies that you could possibly devise. And it becomes politically impossible to do this. Now, we need an honest discussion about it as a society, about what to do. Now, it may be that you need to do something compensatory on the other side. Yeah, we can have that debate. But clearly, the current set of policies is not tenable in the long run.
So many thanks for those perspectives. Just to conclude,
Yes, I think let's move on.
Yeah,
Sure. Give other people a chance.
Sure.
Okay. Ma'am, you wanted to speak.
Thank you so much for a most interesting lecture. I was looking at your chart. You mentioned about Parshuram, and I think you reclaimed something, and you spoke about the drowning of Krishna's Dwarka. So what I know is that Parshuram was the 6th incarnation of Lord Vishnu, and Krishna is the 8th avatar. So how come these? You said the river had already dried up by 4th. So what has this got to do with all these two incidents?
So the point being made is that we seem to have a cultural memory of sea level going up and down. For example, the time of Manu, which is even earlier, Matsya Avatar, the sea actually rises dramatically. I don't know whether that is a memory of an ancient event, but as I mentioned, there was clearly a big cataclysmic drowning of the sea.
Fish is the first avatar of Lord Vishnu.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm talking about Matsya. We do know geologically that about 8,000 years ago or 7,500 years ago, somewhere in that range, there was massive flooding around the world. In fact, the Persian Gulf is the result of a massive flood that happened, because Persian Gulf is only about 35 meters deep. People don't realize this. So in fact, 9,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf is all land. And suddenly, the sea levels went up very rapidly and flooded the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf you see today is the result of a great flood. The same thing happened with Saurashtra. It happened with our coastline. India was linked to Sri Lanka for a long period of time. That got drowned. So all of that drowning happened. But that drowning went past today's coastlines further up and then came down. So what you are seeing is many, and in between also, it's not like it's a straight line. And we are dealing with thousands of years, so it's going up, down, up, down, up, down. So our coastline is going in, coming out, going in, coming out, going in, coming out. There are repeated floods that are happening. So even in historical times, Mahabalipuram gets drowned. So the point I'm making is that our legends seem to reflect this. There is a period where the water is going out. There is some time later the water comes in. And we have evidence of this happening in our texts. And it correlates also with the drying of rivers and so on. So the reason I'm making this point is that all of this may not be exact memories, but this is an echo of something we probably experienced.
Some of the echoes may be about the water. If it was really shallow, maybe even in the Red Sea, then Moses wouldn't have had to do too much to part the water. And if it was even shallower still around the salt pans, then Jesus could have walked on water also. But
Who knows?
Who knows? But if there are no other questions, I'd actually like to ask a closing question myself before we end this wonderful session. And yes, sir. This is the ex-chairman of SBI.
Yeah, I know very
Mr.
well.
Rajneesh.
We have worked on many things together.
So, what is happening to our cities, Sanjeev?
Sanjeev, please answer.
Clearly, we need to do something very desperate about this.
Desperate.
And let me say here that the last 10 years, we have spent a great deal of effort interconnecting our cities. The intercity infrastructure is dramatically improved. I think that the next decade or two should be about intra-city infrastructure.
Intercity infrastructure, and somebody needs maybe you give this task to Vinayak, that the way our cities are administered. If that fundamental, you put an IS officer, he comes for 6 months, no connect with the city, and then he leaves. So how will these cities will be administered if there is no emotional connect, no sense of history about those cities, and
Well, we actually do have elected councillors and so on, but they haven't been very effective at all.
Plus, you rejected a lot of loans on when you were chairman SBI for many of these cities.
So it must be your fault.
Because you said they would return the loan and all that.
but really,
No, we really need to have, as a people, we need to have an honest conversation about all of this. And, in the end,
75th Amendment suggests itself. Jagan, ex-director of NIUA is sitting here.
Yeah, my own view of all this is that 74, 70, all this does not matter. Ultimately, you need to be clear who is in charge of a particular landscape. Okay, it does not, even if it is a IAS officer, they have to be there for fixed terms.
And deliver.
If it is there if you're going to do it through an elected system, there must be a clearly elected mayor. It cannot be some general vague council. Somebody has to be in charge. It has to be clear. Whoever it is, however you do it. Because after all, you go to the rest of the world, okay, they have all kinds of models. You have mayors in some places who are very powerful, like in New York. You have places like Shanghai, which have very strong local leaders. You have places like Vietnam, which are very poor, but they have better run cities, which are run by bureaucrats. So there are many kinds of models. All of them work better than whatever we do.
Yeah, but we have forgotten about the smart cities.
That we have.
We have forgotten.
Very right, Saraswati might remember. So my last question to you before we close the session, and I'm going to ask Kavindra to be close now, because there is a time. You can catch it also. Unless you have a very short question and you're not going to give a speech. Yeah, please.
So, Namaskar Shabaike, everyone. So, I used to be a student of anthropology at Academy University. Nowadays, because of very...
Speak into the mic.
Hello?
Yeah.
So, my name is Odinga. So, I remember on the first day of my seminar, college, we were a group of friends, transdisciplinary geology students and everyone. So we had this conversation, je amra listen Bengali, amra Saraswati no jeta khoji. It's very spontaneous. We got a khoj and there were people from genetics department, I was from anthropology, my friends from geology, etc. So even if there's a spontaneous spark in ourselves to find the river, do whatever we can, the infrastructure our universities provide, specifically the government institutions, I think we are very far from what it needs to reach there.
No, there may be the case, but let me say that in the specific case of Saraswati, we've actually been researching it for quite some time. The evidence on this is now overwhelming. So we have a very clear idea where it is. Interestingly, Kurukshetra University actually has a center dedicated just to this, and I've given this presentation there as well. There are now lots of, the Khaggar has now been very well documented, the sites along it have been documented. So in the specific case of Saraswati, I can say that it is now researched.
My question was
Other places are doing
my question was different. I think why are we so armchair when dealing with anti-speculative subjects, like the techniques of baiting, when it's actually needed to be...
No, I agree. We have a ruminating culture. That is generally true. As a people, we have a ruminating culture. We are not an empirical culture. We had historically in ancient times, but today's it is true. So in fact, one of the funny things, I have lived much of my adult life outside of India. I went to, after Delhi University, I went to Oxford, and I basically stayed out of India for long years. So one of the things that strikes me, now that I have re-participating in Indian intellectual life, is that most debates, and they can be very hot debates, and we are all Bengali, the three of us, so they can be very hot debates, without any reference to data or empiricism. No, but this is very strange, because in any other society that would not be the case. Instead, the ability to win the argument is not based on empiricism, but the ability to quote authority. So, I will say, so and so must be true because Netaji said, then he will say, no, Gandhiji said this, he will say, Ambedkar said this, and then we will fight about which of these three characters is the greatest person ever, because his quote will then win the argument. Nothing about the evidence.
My
No, I think we'll now, otherwise this is becoming a sorry, I think we are now going to end this session, otherwise it will become a coffee house discussion, which is not, with this, I'm going to now request Kaveri to please come and give a vote of thanks, and and on behalf of all of us.
No, your last question.
Who wants the last question?
Sorry, my last question by popular demand is, with this huge battery of incontrovertible evidence that you just said, including Kurukshetra research and all of that, why is it that there is still such a large body of opinion that thinks that the Saraswati is mythological and not?
Because our entire intellectual basis is not based on evidence, it is based on authority. Because Mr. Mortimer said something and he died, now I can't change his mind. Mortimer Wheeler.
Right.
So thank you so much, it was so enlightening. We have very few public intellectuals in India, so this was a really precious interaction. Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And thank you so much, Vinayak. May I ask you to please gift him this shawl as a small memento?
Sir, Harappan shawl?
No. And thank you so much. It's been a wonderful audience. You're so...